In this video, I'm talking about 15 common beginner mistakes I see all the time. Avoiding these will save you a lot of frustration, and it will also give you a more beautiful, productive garden. And number 15 makes gardening a whole lot more fun, so be sure to stay till the end. If you're new here, welcome to Garden Unwind. I'm Cindy, and this channel is all about helping you grow a garden you love. If you're just starting out, be sure to check out my Gardening Basics playlist. I'll link it in the description. Let's start with landscape fabric. Many people think that this is going to solve all their weed problems. I'll just put landscape fabric down and then I never have to weed. This isn't true. Weeds, they find their way through it, or worse, they grow in the mulch on top of it, and then those roots grow through the landscape fabric, and then it's even more of a pain to weed. And not only that, landscape fabric, it's yet another element of plastic that we're adding to the garden that we don't need. And you inevitably see it. It's also an eyesore because even if you mulch on top of it, it rains, the mulch washes away, and you see plastic in your garden. It's not ideal. And when you go to plant something, it's also a big pain because you have to dig around, find the landscape fabric, cut a big hole in it. And it also doesn't allow for your garden to mature naturally by things self-sowing because the landscape fabric gets in the way of that. And it's just a big mess. So I just recommend staying away from it. Just keep on top of your weeds the natural way. If you get them while they're young, it's not a big deal. You can even just go out there with a hoe and just brush, 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 and you're done. And just make sure you mulch. If you stay on top of mulch, that keeps a lot of the weed pressure down. Which leads me to mistake number 2, not staying on top of weeds. If you don't stay on top of weeds, they can really become a nightmare. If you get them when they're young, it's no big deal. You can weed very easily. But if you wait until they're mature, those roots grow seriously, and you have to get a weed completely by the root. You can't just cut it off the top with a string trimmer. Many people do this and then they wonder why the weeds are back a week later. Well, you got to get it out by the root, and that's hard to do if you wait. And also, if you let it go to flower, that's a bad idea because those flowers quickly turn into seeds and then they spread their progeny everywhere, and then you have tens of thousands of weeds to deal with instead of just one. So I do recommend keeping on top of weeds. You don't want to use herbicides. Some people just think they can just spray around their plants. Well, those herbicides, they do affect your plants. They're not good. They're not good for your soil. They kill your beneficial microorganisms and your worms, and they're not even good for you. They've been proven to cause cancer, so you really want to stay away from herbicides. Just get rid of your weeds the old-fashioned way. The third one is skipping mulch. This is a bad idea. Mulch is so important for your garden. It helps retain moisture, and it helps, like we said before, with the weed suppression and to regulate your soil temperature to keep your plants happy, to keep them cozy in the winter, cool in the summer, and it improves your soil as it breaks down. It also makes your garden look tidy and well cared for. You can check out my video all about mulch. I'll link it in the description. It gives you 4 free options. Many new gardeners make the mistake of just not going bold enough when they're putting in a new garden bed. They'll just put a strip, sometimes just a 2-foot strip, maybe along the back of their yard, along their fence. And while this is a good start, you do have to start somewhere. You're gonna want to extend that bed if you want a really good looking garden because you just need some more depth. You need at least 6 feet, more if you can do it. The deeper your garden goes, the more opportunity you have to give it dimension. So if you do start narrow, just maybe expand it every year so that it gets wider and wider and more substantial. And remember, grass is boring and it's a pain to mow. Don't be afraid to get rid of grass to create more garden. You'll be happy you did. If you're worried you're gonna have too much to mulch, again, check out my mulch video. It gives you free options. Another one is I'll start my garden when I have my raised bed. I don't know when this started. People think that you need raised beds to have a garden. This is not true in the vast majority of areas. Many people are afraid, oh, I have clay, oh, I have rocks. Well, you know what? Clay actually holds on to nutrients very well. I have clay soil and I love it. I really appreciate it in times of drought because it holds on to water well. And yes, this is Rockland County. I have a ton of rocks in my land. I have had to dig them out, but you know what? They come out. It takes a little extra work, but it's worth it. It's way less work than having to build raised beds, buy raised beds, and then figure out what to fill them with, which leads me to my next mistake. If you do have raised beds, you don't want to fill them with potting soil. Potting soil is for pots. It's not for raised beds. It drains way too fast. It doesn't have enough nutrients. You want to have a good soil. If you do need to do raised beds for some reason, I recommend contacting your local tree company arborist that can bring you truckloads of soil that you can put in, and this soil many times it doesn't have any life in it, which can be a good thing because sometimes people get soil deliveries and they end up with invasive species of like jumping worms or other things. So you just want to get a soil, and then you can add compost and organic matter, broken down leaves, and over time build that soil so that it will be healthy for your plants, hold on to water, and you'll be good to go. Oh, and another one with raised beds. Skip the landscape fabric again underneath it. You don't need to do that. When you're putting a bunch of soil on there, maybe in the beginning you want to lay something down. You could lay cardboard down if you want to keep the grass from growing back up. But even if your raised bed is pretty deep, if you're putting soil on top of that, that's going to weaken the grass and the weeds underneath. So the ones that come up, it's not going to be that big a deal. If you put landscape fabric down, you're creating a barrier. So those microorganisms can't travel freely between the landscape fabric and your raised bed. And you want those roots to go down deep into the native soil if you want those plants to be drought resistant and healthy. Another mistake is if you are in an area where deer frequent and you don't have a protected area, you have to make sure you're planting things the deer aren't going to want. Now, there are many plants that claim to be deer resistant, but many of us can tell you they're not. It's not true. There has been so much development in this country that the deer, they're kind of lowering their standards when it comes to what they'll eat because there's not that much out there for them. So you really got to be careful. Talk to your local garden centers, talk to your neighbors, or watch my upcoming video because I have tested all the plants that I'm going to talk about in that video and you'll be in good shape. So just be sure to hit the notification bell and subscribe so you don't miss it. Mistake number 8 is wimpy fencing. When I first put my first vegetable garden in, I used netting, plastic netting. I had tomato plants growing. I was so proud of them as I started to watch them to form, go from green to pink to red. They were going to be ripe the very next day and I was going to pick them, but guess who else was watching? The deer were watching. They chewed right through the netting. They walked through my fence. My little stakes were wimpy. They bent them and they went for the tomatoes. I found that heavy-duty welded wire fencing with heavy-duty steel T-posts that you bang in the ground works great. They can't go through this. They can jump over it, but if your garden is small enough, if it's only 12 foot wide, that's fine. Chances are they're not going to jump in it. They don't jump in my narrow bed. In my bigger one, that's about 20 feet, as long as you're putting things in there like bamboo stakes, which you need to stake, your vegetables anyway, then they don't like all those obstacles. They're afraid they're going to get stabbed if they jump over, so they don't jump over that, even just with a 5-foot fence. So that works great for me. If you have a huge property, you're going to want to do probably an 8-foot fence, but one way my mom gets around it, she has a 6-foot fence, but she puts willow sticks, or you could use bamboo or whatever you have. She weaves those sticks in it. So they're kind of like spears. So again, the deer don't want to jump over that and get stabbed. That's been working great. Since she's done that, the deer don't jump her garden, and it's huge. It's like a flower farm. They don't go in. Another big mistake is beginner gardeners, many times they just have blooms in the summer. Spring and fall are the trickier months, so I recommend going heavy on the spring bulbs. And if you are in an area where there's deer, you can do daffodils, which are deer resistant. If you have a protected area, you can do tulips. Creeping phlox is another deer resistant spring one. Crocuses. Crocuses are a great one because they come up first, so they give the bees something to eat. That's another reason you want to really be careful to have blooms all through the spring so that you can feed the pollinators as soon as they're ready. In the fall, you can try things like Rudbeckia, perennial sunflower, helenium, salvias, Japanese anemones. These are all great fall blooming plants. One thing you can do is just go to the garden center in the spring, go in the fall, and see what's blooming then. Plant it then, and then you'll have spring and fall blooming plants. Mistake number 10, thinking a trowel is a shovel. A trowel is useful for certain things. I especially like a little trowel for getting deep into weeds so I can get them out by the root, for planting a small little plug. But when it comes to planting plants, use a shovel. When it comes to planting tulip bulbs, use a shovel. You can plant 10 bulbs at once in like 2 seconds. It saves your back. Mistake 11, underwatering and overwatering. Underwatering. In times of drought, watch your evergreens. If they're not established yet, don't ask me how I know. They don't let you know when they're thirsty. They just die quietly. And they can be expensive. But you don't want to water your garden too much. Some people water their garden even after a rain. You don't need to do this, and you don't want to do this. If you overwater your plants, they don't have to go looking for water, so they don't develop those deep roots they would. Let them find the water. This is especially an issue in times of drought, because if the roots are only near the surface and you don't have rain for weeks on end, that plant is really going to struggle. So it actually pays to neglect your garden sometimes. Mistake number 12, not edging. I rarely see a new gardener that has a nice crisp edge. This does wonders for your garden. Many new gardeners will take rocks. They'll just have rocks along the edge to hold the mulch in and figure that will separate the grass from the garden bed, and it might look okay at first, but what happens over time is those rocks settle in, grass grows up through in between them, and you never have a nice line. If you just take a spade shovel and you just cut a nice edge every year, once a year, either do it in the spring or the fall, and you dig out a nice chunk of that soil, you're gonna have beautiful edges. And then every time you mow, just hit it with the string trimmer, and that'll crisp that line right up. It's beautiful. It gives you a much more professional look. Mistake number 13, not pruning. Many gardeners, new gardeners, are afraid to cut back their plants. Well, I'm telling you, if you do this, especially with plants that you know are gonna flop over, you're gonna be so much happier. You're gonna get bushier plants, you're gonna get so much flowers. One plant in particular I like to do this with is Russian sage. I started this a few years ago. In June, I take it and I cut it way back. It does flower later, but it's worth it because I get more flowers, the plant's bushier, and it extends the season of the plant. So it blooms later in the season than it would have, which again helps me get into fall with blooms. Mistake number 14 is spraying pests and killing beneficial bugs. Pesticides might seem like a quick fix, but they are problematic because when you spray a plant, you're killing not only the pests, but you're also killing the beneficial insects. And you're also killing the food source for those beneficial insects. For example, ladybugs like to frequent gardens where they can find some aphids to eat. Now, if you kill all the aphids, they're not going to frequent your garden. The same thing with birds. Birds, a big part of their diet is insects. So if you're killing off the insects, you're not going to have the birds, and then the birds won't come and eat the pests for you. So it's a cycle. So if you avoid spraying and killing all the bugs, then you can have the beneficials come in and balance things out. Now, if you have a seriously infested plant, sometimes it's worth it to just sacrifice that plant. If it's not, you know, a deer shrub rose. If it is something like a rose, it's worth it to go through and hand pick. I had one of my roses that I love. It was infested with spongy moth caterpillars last year. So I hand picked them, smushed them, and the plant came back beautifully, even though it looked like it was dying. So do what you can to manually remove them. You can also use a solution of dish soap and water if a plant is really heavily infested in aphids, even though you don't want to kill all the aphids. Sometimes, you know, it's okay to just hit one plant. Good. Another thing you can do to avoid spraying pesticides is have companion plants. I like to have host plants. Host plants attract the pests to keep them away from the plant you care more about. For example, I care about my grapes, and the aphids go after grapes. So I like to plant some extra Brussels sprout plants around them, and then the aphids go after the Brussels sprouts, and then I have extra food for my chickens because they don't care if the leaves are covered in aphids. So it's really a win-win. This also works with nasturtiums. They're supposed to attract the cabbage butterfly, which is a big nuisance for your kale, and also calendula, that's supposed to attract the aphids too. So this way your garden will have an army of beneficial insects and birds that will defend it from being taken over by pests, and it'll just keep everything in balance. And then you don't have to work so hard. Mistake number 15, being afraid to move plants. Many new gardeners tell me this. I don't want to move anything. I'm afraid it's gonna die. If you never move anything in your garden, you're not really gardening. It is so fun to move plants, rearrange things, reassess, decide, do I really love this plant? Is it doing it for me? Is it too much work? And sometimes plants are just sad. They really need to be moved. I had this little lime hydrangea that was in a shady corner, and it would just stretch. It was just searching for the sun. So finally, in fall time, I dug it out and I moved it. Sure, it pouted. The leaves wilted and dropped off before, you know, they normally would have. In spring, it came back strong, and then by the next fall, it was the star of the show. Full of blooms, sturdy, strong stalks. So I definitely recommend, you know, moving plants. The best time to do this is spring and fall, but a lot of plants you can even move in the summer if you cut them back, as long as you water them. That's the most important thing. Don't let a newly planted plant go without water. If you'd really like to up your gardening game, I recommend getting a greenhouse. Well, what's a greenhouse for? What do I use mine for? If you'd like to find out, you can check out this video. Take care and thanks for watching.